Hey everyone, Sycra here, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to go from realistic eyes to stylized eyes. Now, I'm covering this topic because a few people have brought it up, and I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was very good that they stated it as going from realism to style, like manga style. And the reason is that there's this myth out there that seems to go like this. You start out drawing cartoon eyes, these kind of eyes. And then you move to anime. And then you get to maybe comic books, like Western comics. And then you go to realism. But this is actually completely backwards. You start with realism. Always start from realism. I mean, you don't have to. You can copy other styles, but the thing is, you won't understand. If you want to understand and you want style to be something that is just for you to play with, then start with realism, and then you can go to comics, which are really, for the most part, Western comics are simplified realism. So it's just simplified. Then there's a split. Then you can go towards cartoony, and it depends what type of cartoons, because you could also have like Disney cartoons, or go towards anime. And then even in anime or manga style, and I know I'm going to refer to it as anime because it seems most people call things anime, even though I know anime is just animated manga, but so it would be more correct to call it a manga style. But let's just call it anime for the sake of this. And there's a split that happens within anime where you could just simplify as well and add a bit of exaggeration, but there's something interesting that happens, and it happens in cartoons as well, that I'll go over. So, starting with realism, what you have to understand is the certain things that most eyes, I would say almost all eyes, but they have in common. And so whenever I think of eyes on a face, and let's just create a head shape, I never think first of the eye. I always think of the eye socket. So the first thing I do is place the eye socket. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail about facial anatomy or anything like that, because as simple as it sounds, covering eyes and how to draw exaggerated eyes, even though it's something most artists teach as this thing for kids, it's actually very advanced. And that's kind of the thing I want to get across, is that this is not a beginner's thing, taking realism and simplifying it. So I'm going to start with the eye sockets, and then, you get your nose and you get your mouth, whatever, that's fine. But focusing on the eyes, within the eye socket then, you have the eyeball. And you can, I've done a video on how to draw eyes, and I cover it this way. You don't have to draw the actual ball, though. You just understand within this is where the eye belongs. And then for men, you tend to get the eyebrow sort of hugging the edge of the top of the eye socket. And for women, it can do that, but often it goes a bit higher. So from a side view, let's say this is the forehead, and then nose comes down like that. Then you have, the mouth. Chin, if we get the eye socket in, and even in side view, I recommend getting the eye socket in, because when you get the eye socket in, what you're thinking of is actually the structure. You're thinking that, hey, there's a cheek that comes down here and goes around, right? And then here, there's going to be an eyeball within this area. And then, so this is the top of the eye socket. So for men, again, the eyebrow sort of hugs that top, and you have different people, but in general tends to hug that more, whereas for women it can go a bit higher above that. Right? Okay, so we have then the eyeball, and then we have the upper and lower eyelid. So we can get those in. And now the upper lid always goes over the lower lid. So this upper portion overlaps this lower portion. And it's important to remember that upper lids have, and lower lids, they have a thickness to them. Now you don't always see that thickness, but it's important to understand that, because especially as the eyes open up, that thickness of the upper lid becomes more and more evident, right? So there's a thickness of the eyelid, and then you have the duct, the tear duct, and now in different eyes it's a little bit different. So you can have eyes where the tear duct sort of is here, and this is more like often more Western, I don't know, Caucasian, African, basically not an Asian eye, although Asian eyes can sometimes be like this, where the tear duct is sort of separated, and then you have the eyeball. But there's also cases where, like with some Asian eyes, that the tear duct is actually within that structure. And then you have the eyelid, but then the next part, so we have the upper lid, lower lid, and with the lower lid I'm going to suggest it very lightly. I don't want to outline it too strong. So you have the lower lid, you have the tear duct, and then you have the crease on the top of the eyelid. And this is again something that differs culturally, or not culturally, ethnically, between different races. And so with Oriental eyes, sometimes you do see that crease and it's very light, and sometimes you don't even see the crease at all. Sometimes you see more of the shape of the eyeball. It really depends, and then, you know, maybe they've had double eye surgery, so they've created that crease, which is, again, that's possible. And you'll notice when I do the crease, I don't just do a straight line like that, because that just doesn't feel right. I make sure the part that's more inside gets a bit darker, and then there's skin, and then kind of peeks out. So anyway, this is why I'm saying this is advanced stuff. It's not simple. So you have that, and then you have the eyelashes, and the eyelashes, so remember we said there's a thickness to the eyelid. Well, the eyelashes start from that thickness, from that shelf. And there's different ways to do eyelashes. One way I like to do them is almost like this, where I create little back and forth U motions, so one that way and then one that way. It doesn't look very good like this, but if you build it up, it's a fast way, because then you can sketch it in really quick, sort of do that, and then you can do the same thing for the lower eyelid, remembering that the lashes come from that portion of the eyelid. And you can look, you know, if you zoom in really close, I don't know why I'm saying zoom in, if you look in a mirror and you look at your eyelid, you'll see where those lashes actually come out from. And again, you don't want to just do like straight line lashes like that. Like, understand that these are hairs and they're sort of a little bit random in how they move, so they go around the form, some clump together. So then you have that. So let's just write down what we have so far. You have the eye socket. And the reason I'm writing it down is because these are the components that we'll need to pay attention to. You have the eye socket, then you have the tear duct. Oh wait, no, then you have the eyeball. Eyeball. Then you have the upper and lower eyelids. So eyelids. Then you have tear duct. And I guess something that I also think of that I guess it's not even necessarily named, but I also think of this part of the eye, the outer corner. So that I pay attention to this and I pay attention to this. And the reason is that sometimes in some eyes, this corner is higher and this corner is like up. You'll get eyes like that. Sometimes they're about the same, even. You can get eyes like that. Sometimes this is actually lower and you get eyes sort of like that. So it's important to know these 2 points. Also, they're very good for measuring, but I'll get into that later. So yeah, you have your tear duct, and then you have the outer corner, I guess I'll call it. And then you have the eyelashes, and you have the, oops, I forgot the crease of the eyelid, crease of eyelid, and then you have the eyebrow, and we've already covered how that sort of hugs the different areas of the eye socket. So eyebrow, and then you have the last 3 elements that I'll talk about, which are the sclera, the iris, and the pupil. So the sclera is basically, it's just the white of the eye. It's all this stuff. Now, iris, of course, most people know it's the colorful part of the eye. And now this doesn't change in size. It's important to know that for realism. It doesn't change in size because in certain styles it does change. So it's important to know that for realism it doesn't change. It's also important to pay attention to just how much of the eye is covered by the iris. It's pretty big. It takes up quite a bit of space. Of course, this again depends on the eye, but often you won't see the whole iris. If you do, it might be with children. Sometimes, you know, with children, you'll see their eyes show more of that. You might get a case where, yeah, you do see the whole iris, or if people are surprised, you'll see the whole iris. But it's very important to understand the relationship between the iris and the sclera. Sometimes when I do realism, and especially if I'm doing caricatures or if I'm copying a realistic person, I don't even focus on the iris at all. What I draw is this shape of the sclera. And it's usually something like that, like you'll get 2 triangle shapes. So then we get, yeah, the iris, and then finally the pupil. And something to think, or not think, but to understand about the pupil is that it usually, not always, but it usually is very close to the top of the eye. And you have the eyelashes. Of course, with girls, you know, it's going to be much more pronounced than with guys. For guys, you don't really need that. And then the upper lid always casts a shadow. So, I mean, almost always. If you had a strong light coming from below, it would still, I don't know, it would be much lighter. But usually we have light coming from above. So then there's a shadow. So that gives the impression that the iris is even more close to the top. I mean, the pupil is even more close to the top because of that, because you have cases like that. And there's another thing to pay attention to, which is that you have, and this is going to get pretty complicated, but let's look at the eyeball. This is if I'm like zooming into an eyeball here, and then, and this is not going to be very much in proportion, but let's say you have the iris here on the eyeball. Then you have a lens on top of this iris. And the pupil is just a hole. It's just a hole in here somewhere. So the iris is like, I think it is like a muscle, and it just opens and closes to allow more light into this hole. But because of this lens is actually filled with liquid. And if you've ever, you have a glass, right? If you have a glass and then let's say it's filled with water and you put your straw in, you might notice that as it goes into the glass, sometimes it's like sort of bends, right? It looks like the straw is bent. You get the same thing, you can get the same thing in a bathtub. If you're taking a bath and you put your arm in, you might notice like, it sort of bends or whatever. And let's just, for exaggeration's sake, really bend that straw. Now, because this is filled with liquid, as light goes in, it also bends. So the position of this pupil can sometimes be slightly off. It's not dead center. And that's another thing to pay attention to. Now, you're seeing all these very specific little details that I'm covering, but all this is what goes into correct stylization. So let's just finish this person. Get the iris in and the pupil. Now the pupil can be small or it can be very dilated. Maybe this person is high. So yeah, that can change, but remember the iris doesn't change. But now let's go into style. So comic book style. Let's deal with that first. Comics. So what this really is just simplification. If you get your real eye, with comics what they tend to do is maybe they straighten things out a bit more. And I didn't start with the eye socket. I guess I could. There's an eye socket here. I usually, when I draw the full head, I remember to get in the eye sockets, and you'll notice like I can scribble them in very roughly. They don't need to be perfect, and then I can get the eyes in, but we'll talk about that later. Right now, talking about comics, and yeah, things might get a bit more straightened out, but you still, you get the top, upper eyelid, you get the crease maybe it's a bit more simplified, and you have the lower lid, and again, the lower lid tends to be less pronounced. If you do this thing where you draw the eye and you make the lower lid very pronounced, it just looks kind of wrong. It looks maybe like the person's wearing makeup, but it's something I see a lot where the lower lid is very pronounced, and usually, especially with guys, you don't want that much of the lower lid. The other thing is that you don't want the eyelashes all coming around like that, because that's not real either. You want the eyelashes, usually they're thicker around this edge and that edge, and then they sort of get thinner towards here. So yeah, and then if someone's wearing mascara, often you'll get very unrealistic eyelashes, which, I don't know, to me they look kind of gross. It reminds me of, like, I don't know, spider legs or something like that. Also, some eyelashes curl up and some are more straight and they go down. So that's another thing. Gotta pay attention to which way the eyelashes go. But anyway, back to the comic style. Yeah, usually you get top part, you get that. Maybe they indicate the tear duct, but it's not absolutely necessary. But usually they do get the crease of the top of the eye. You'll get a simplified eyebrow. And then you get the iris and highlight and the pupil. So there we go. That's pretty basic for comics, and you can see it's not that different. So this is just a simplification. And then for different styles, you could get more or less simplified, but this is generally what happens. And I did want to cover, which I didn't mention, the highlight of the eye. And basically, something to consider is that, first of all, the highlight can be any shape. It's the shape of, can't be any shape. It depends on the light source. It is a reflection of the light source. So if you're outside and the light source is the sun, you will usually get a circle highlight. If you are indoors and your light is like, maybe it's coming from a window, well, you'll actually get the window shape as the highlight. And if there's like a pane, you know, window panes, that will show up too. So you'll get like light part, light part, light part, light part, separated by this not light part. So that's something to keep in mind. And also, if the light's coming from here, I mentioned already, right, that the eye has this lens, and then you have the pupil here, and this lens is filled with liquid. So what happens is the light, let's say the light's coming from here, comes here, and then it hits this, and so you get a highlight here, right? You get the highlight where the light hits the lens and it reflects to your eyes, so the viewer's eyes. But the light also, some of it travels through and it also gets bent. And so what happens is, opposite where the light hit, you'll get a lightening up of the eye. So what often happens, and this is also useful for anytime you want to do like jewel type things, is create a highlight and then darken around the highlight, because remember, especially because the shadow is being cast from the upper eyelid. And then directly opposite, you can actually lighten things up, and then you'll get this very jewel-like thing where it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of nice, looks pretty. The other thing is, often people make the highlights too big. You get highlights that look like, I don't know, it just doesn't look good. Often the highlights look better when they're small. So, another thing to keep in mind. Okay, so this is comics. Now let's go into, what was the other ones? Oh. Now let's go into cartoons, I guess, and then we'll go into anime. So, with Disney, it's usually keep a lot of anime with, a lot of anatomy with Disney eyes. It's not just simplifying it anymore. A lot of it gets exaggerated or changed. And now sometimes the eye is just a pupil. So you get the white of the eye, and then you just have a pupil. And sometimes it's just the basic circle. So I guess, if you're like, The Simpsons or something, they just have eyes that's a circle, and then a dot, and then maybe an eyebrow. And for a style like this, yeah, of course children can do it, and it's very easy because it doesn't have much thought that goes into it. But what you're doing here is something very different, and that is you're not simplifying, you're actually distorting reality, and it's fine because our brains are very good at making things symbols. For instance, you look at a picture and a kid's done this, and that's not what the sun looks like, but that's the sun. Like, we understand that. We look at that and it's like, okay, yeah, that's not, well, now it's a sunflower. But you get that that's the sun. Whenever we see this, whenever we see like a light area with black in the middle, we get that that's an eye. So cartoons take advantage of this, and it's like, okay, fine, if you're going to accept this, then that's what I'll do. I'll do an eye. And then in other styles, they'll give an iris as well. So that's another way of simplifying if you want to go from realistic. I guess if you're content to go into cartooning, this is pretty easy because, maybe you'll get an upper eyelid, but it's up to you what you want to get rid of. So remember we had all those components, right? The eye socket, the eyeball, the eyelid, tear duct. Which do you want to get rid of? So if you are doing a style that's just a circle and a dot, the eye socket, you don't have to draw it, but you still need it. It's still there somewhere. Eyeball, you kept that. Eyelids, depends, you know, in some styles they'll actually include the eyelid. And something important, even with a cartoon style, is to understand that the eyelid, as it gets closer or more open, it's going to curve. As it gets closer to the middle, it sort of straightens out. And then if it ever goes over this point, you know, it will start curving down. This curve, that's what I'm talking about. See if I include the eyeball. Now this is sort of like a lazy look. But tear ducts pretty much are out for cartoon style. There's no corners with that round thing, so we got rid of outer corner. Crease of eyelid, usually no. Eyelashes, depends if there's like a character that's a girl, but then they do this often. They do this thing with maybe only 3, 4, 5 eyelashes, but they're more straight, like something like that. Eyebrow you keep, sclera you keep. Iris, in this case, you lose the iris. But if you've got certain styles, keep the iris. And then the pupil, of course, stays. So that's kind of your options when you draw in this style. And as you turn the head, so let's say we've got a side view eye, you'll notice you get that sort of triangular shape that forms. And we're keeping everything the same, so we still have the pupil near the top. And side views have their own special thing to them. Done a video series on eyes on Pencil Kings, and then it covers many more views, so I'm sort of hesitant to go into so much detail because it's like, the information's already out there. But anyway, you have the side view, and then with certain cartoon styles, some keeps the eyes exactly the same. It's just a circle, and then you've got the dot. And others might compress the eye. So in a side view, it's like that, and in a front view, it's like that. And now speaking of that, you also can get eyes that are not even circles anymore. And this is where it's like you're not simplifying anymore. You're going into your own thing. You're taking advantage of our brain's ability to see symbols. Now, let's go into anime eyes. So, anime eyes, pretty much, most of them have all these components. You get the eye socket, you get the eyelids and tear duct and all that. So let's go over that. Let's create an anime eye. So let's start off with a face, and I'm just sort of reminding myself that I'm doing an anime face. So I'm simplifying the draw. I'm making it so it's not so not quite realistic. It sort of gets much bigger in the cranium than in a normal face. Whether or not you want to do that crosshair that divides the face in half, that's up to you. But yeah, we can get in our eye sockets, and then get a very minimalized small nose. So it's smaller than it should. Well, I don't know. You know, it's a style, right? Often you get very small minimalistic noses, small minimalistic lips. Okay, so now we have our eye socket. Next thing is you can put in the eyeball, but instead of just putting in a ball, I'm going to simplify it differently. I'm just going to get in an eye shape. And I'm making it so the outer corner, remember I said there was a tear duct, and then the outer corner, it's in a way that the outer corner is much higher in this case. And this is all my choice, right? I can decide where I'm going to do that. where I'm going to put the outer corner. And this is why it's important to go from realism first, because I could easily change this up and it's going to be fine. Okay, now let's get the crease of the upper eyelid, which also establishes the eyelid. And this one's going to be fairly, because I'm going to stick with something close to reality, it's going to be fairly pronounced. I'm going to put in the eyelashes, but something you can do even in the realistic style. If you have an eye, especially if the eye is a bit more like you're not doing a close-up where you actually see the eyelashes. Like let's say I have a smaller eye here, right? So what you can do to indicate the upper eyelashes is instead of going up vertical and making those strokes, you can just actually strengthen the make horizontal strokes that create the value of the eyelashes. So this is suggesting that yes, there are eyelashes here, and there are so many that it just sort of looks like that. And that's what you'll notice a lot in anime eyes. They sometimes just simplify this as an area, and sometimes they'll even actually, while drawing, you just break it down anyway. So like this area is just going to be filled with black. Sometimes that's not even black. But yeah, you'll get that. So that's where the eyelash would be. Maybe you see some eyelashes. And then we get the iris. Now, usually the iris is pretty big because we've increased the size of the eye. But if you pay attention to this anyway, you'll notice the eye's not that big. I think something that especially kids do when they see anime eyes is there's a tendency to draw the head and then forget about the eye socket, but just do something like this. Maybe they do get the horizontal lines, because right now it looks sort of like eyebrows, but they'll get that in, and then they get the bottom, and then they put like a nose. It's usually a point for a nose, and then they get a mouth, and then they just join these, and that's the style they do. Like, okay, it's like I've drawn anime, and the eyes are just insanely huge. And there are styles with big eyes, but they, even with those big eyes, they have eye sockets. They have an understanding to them. So anyway, it's difficult even looking at this. I want to get rid of it. Let's see. Can do that. And yeah. Okay. Okay, so back to this. We have our eyelashes, and can simplify that, as I said, by just making horizontal strokes to get in a value. So it's just understanding what your options are. I could do this. I could make horizontal strokes and get in my value, but I don't have to. I can strengthen the outside lines, but I don't have to. I can add a bit more emphasis where the lower lashes would be. I could actually indicate the lower lashes, or I don't have to. See, this is where it becomes you are in charge of your style because you understand all the components, right? I understand that there's going to be a tear duct, so I can create that, maybe a little tear duct, but I don't have to. I understand underneath the eye there's a crease for the lower eyelid. I could lightly indicate that or not. I understand that there's eyebrows, so can put the eyebrows in. And with most anime styles, you tend to get more thin eyebrows, but again, that's up to you. You could go really thick, and that's there too. And I'm hesitant to even call it an anime style, because for people that know what they're doing, it's just a case of you've taken reality and you've bent it to whatever you want, right? Okay, so now we have this. And then you can get the pupil. And often a popular style these days is to not make pupils very dark, to actually make them light, and sometimes you can take that one step further and even just sort of create some tone that just implies a pupil. You could put that highlight thing where you have the highlight, and then remember we said it gets light on the opposite side, so then you get light on the opposite side, and maybe for this we will include the pupil. Then you get the pupil, get light on the opposite side, and then we can just shade all this in. And then you can actually shade that in just a bit. It's like, okay, great. So now you have some anime-ish eyes. But this is just going to, and I'm just going to darken around the iris, because the iris does get dark around the edges. In a realistic eye, you usually get a border of darker area, and then you have the pupil. And often you'll get like a blue rim around the iris. If you zoom in, you'll see that. And then you have like a certain shapes within the iris. And anyway, so all this so far is like, yeah, it's taking what's there and leaving it like that. But this gives you a very I mean, some anime, some manga looks like this, but the way I see it is it's almost a very American person's approach, or a Western approach to anime eyes. You've taken reality and you've simplified it in a way to get it look like this. But there's one step, if you really want to understand how to draw manga, how to draw anime, there's something, and it's a cultural difference that you have to understand. And it is that in the West, we represent much more through realism. And in other cultures, their approach is just make it look cool if it looks cool. It's just for the sake of aesthetics, for the sake of appeal, or for the sake of telling a story. So they're not stuck so much to reality. If this looks cool, fine, do it. But you could also break it. It doesn't have to be realistic as long as it looks cool, or as long as it helps to convey emotion. You know, if I did something where, and the same thing can be true even in a Western comic. Sometimes if someone's really surprised, you might get an eye that it's like, okay, that's our eye shape, got that, but then you've got like a very small pupil and iris, and it's like, oh no, this person's shocked. Well, what we've done here is we've broken away from reality. And that's very important, because if you don't understand that styles allow you to break reality, not just simplify, not just minimize, not just exclude certain parts, but actually break reality, then you will be limited in what you're doing. And what's happening here is with this surprised eye, and it looks pretty legitimate, right? It's because, you know, when we are surprised, our eyelids open up and you see more of that iris. So the iris hasn't changed shape. The pupil might get smaller. The iris hasn't changed shape. But we just see more of this. But this gives us an even more exaggerated look. So now we have this eye, fine. But let's play with it more. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to lower the opacity of this so we just see it through. And now let's make decisions. Okay, maybe I want to focus on the upper lid and the eyelashes. So I'm going to do that. Now, this whole area from here to here, I'm going to simplify. I'm just going to indicate where these eyelashes would go. Okay? Now, I'm not going to even fill in this. I might indicate a bit of where this tear duct is. And I'm going to include the crease, but ever so slightly, just very simply. Now I'm going to add the iris, but what I'm going to do is I'm not going to make it round. Like, of course the iris should be a round shape. I'm going to distort it. And I'm actually taking it, I'm doing this, which is completely wrong. I mean, if I did it like this, it would be more right. But I'm just ignoring that. And again, this is the thing that you have to get in your mind, is that it's okay to break things. And I think there's a lot of people who don't really understand manga will look at this and be like, I hate manga, it's so messed up. I don't understand it looks weird. And I suppose if I never grew up with manga, maybe I would see that, because it is pretty messed up. But anyway, so now I'm going to add some highlights, and I'm going to create a pupil, but I'm going to stretch it out sort of along the lines of the iris that also got stretched out. And I can add more highlights, but I'm going to add more stuff just because it creates this look of almost more shinies in the eye. You can sort of go wild with it, and then you can add shading however you want, or even not. And this is where it goes into a case of you're creating your own style. You're doing your own thing. You've taken what you know should be there or could be there, and now you've changed it. Like, okay, so now we have this, and it's much more stylized than, right? This is much more stylized than that, what we originally started with. But it still works. And if I'm doing this, what I'm doing is I'm simplifying things, I'm making things sharper. So I could take it a step further and really sharpen things up. Switch to the G pen. And don't need these lines. But now I hope you're seeing how you get from one point to the next, and why there's nothing simple about anime, really. If you're just following tutorials of someone who's like, oh, start out by doing a cross, and then create 2 lines, and then create this shape, and create this shape, and then do this, and then like that. Hey, you have anime eyes, awesome. It's like, yeah, it's okay, but what if I wanted to do things in a completely different way? How do I treat that? What's really going on here? How do I create my own style? Well, you might not know. So anyway, if we were doing a style like this, what I'd probably do is, since everything's getting sharp, I'd probably sharpen the outside of the face, maybe sharpen that chin line. The nose can be more sharp, the mouth too. And there. So it's like, yeah, okay. You got your face and it's doing its thing. Whatever. But again, all this is from the knowledge that we already have. Okay, now let's do some more. And let's say I am looking at things in perspective. So let's say it's a 3/4 view. So now I'm starting just by getting the cranium, and again, I'm not explaining it, and it's difficult because you need to learn this first. But anyway, in a head like this, you have perspective. So let's say vanishing points around here, the horizon's here. Then we do get perspective to the face. So when I get this line, this bottom of the chin's going in that direction, top of the head's going here, The eye sockets take up, maybe this one takes up this amount of space, but then this one, it's going to be smaller in height. See, if I go from this height to this height, and then this height to this height, this is shorter than this, and that's because of the perspective. And also this distance gets compressed, and this doesn't. So then, okay, so then we can get the eye in. And maybe in this one I'm going to make it so, because in the past ones I had the eye where the upper corner is sort of higher and the tear duct is lower. This one I'm going to make it the opposite, so I'm going to make it maybe level. So the lower corner is there, and get our perspective across. And now this is why I said before that it was very important to use, that these things would be very helpful for measuring. Because what I do is, people are often worried or concerned, like, okay, I did this eye and it's good, how do I get the other eye? Well, if you haven't practiced, what you can do is draw a straight line across from the top and the bottom, and then find these points. And usually they'll say, you know, there's one eye space in between. That's fine, but what I actually like to do is, and this is something that helps as well, is to break free of guidelines just a bit so that you train your brain to see things. It takes longer. It's easier if you follow a guideline, but I think it's worth it more if you actually maybe just loosely rely on guides. And then I just want to see, okay, what is this distance? And I try and replicate it. Where is the corner of the eye? And then, you know, you can get in a similar shape and then just sort of break it down. And it takes a while to get to this point. It's not like I could just do this like right now it's pretty easy where I could draw any eye and make it fit. But it did take a while before I could just, you know, do that, and I don't need any guidelines or whatever. But anyway, so we have this. Now, from this view, we're going to see inside the eye. So I'm going to zoom in to that. And so here's the eyeball. Here's a tear duct. And we have the upper lash, or the upper lid. It's actually visible. And then there's that corner of the eye, which in this case is about the same level as the tear duct. And so now we have that upper lid showing quite a bit. And you get, you know, the iris, which is going to be more compressed, and you'll have your pupil, which is going to be closer, because remember there's that lens distortion, but also how we're looking at it. It's going to make it so it's not going to be, if this is the iris, it's not going to be right here. No, it's going to be like more back. It's going to be inside, because this, what we're seeing is actually the lens of the eye. So remember that the eyelashes come out from this point, right? From underneath the upper lid. And so what happens is this area gets thicker. And so that's what's happening when I'm doing this. I'm making it so this side is actually thicker, and I'm creating that black area. And then we can get the iris in, and remember that this one's going to be squished more. This pupil is going to be more in the center, and you get something like that, right? Okay, so that's the more realistic eye. But what do we notice? So something that you can do when you're developing styles is notice patterns of what's happening. So what's happening? Well, because we see more of the inside of the eye, and because the eyelashes come from that point, we have it darker. We have it darker here. We have this part of the eye much more compressed. This eye is much smaller. The shape is different than this eye. And it's like, okay, so taking that, let's apply it to an anime eye then. And so I'm just going to start. I'm going to create face shape. I'm going to create my eye sockets. so far it's very similar. But now I just apply these things that I noticed. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna make this eye much more compressed. Gonna show more of that dark area around the outside because of that. Gonna make this eye, and I'm starting to bend it much more. I'm being much more loose. And I know this eye is gonna be more compressed, and this one's not so compressed. I have the highlight, but I can do the highlight however I want it. So maybe actually the highlight's going to be on the opposite side. And something you'll notice in anime is they're not necessarily, they don't, as I mentioned before, they don't care, or not they, but often it's not as important to be right. For instance, having the highlight here means the light's coming from down here, right? But it's not a big deal. Also, I'm not even drawing in the full highlight. I'm just sort of cutting out from it because I can, because it's an option. And then I can add in some shading. And I don't even have to. I could actually just do a full gradient from the top to the bottom. And there, we got eyes. I'm understanding how this connects, how there's this flow here between this portion and the eyebrow. Maybe in this case, actually, I could go even more squished with the face. So make it more squished. And this is understanding anatomy as well. You know, there's a cheek. There's a cheek that needs to come here. It's not just... I'm really not looking at a book and then saying, okay, this is an anime style and where do I do it? I'm pushing and pulling anatomy because I know, well, if this is this way, what you can look at is books for inspiration to understand, hey, what has someone else done and got away with? Because that's how anime really, if you look at manga, it started out, I think Astro Boy was the first anime, and it was based off Disney, and then they just kept pushing it. It's like, okay, if we can, you know, for instance, maybe Western comics could do this too, where it's like, okay, let's start with an eye that's just like this, and it's like that, and it's like, okay, what if we got rid of the iris, and what if we made the iris a weird shape? What if we made the pupil a weird shape? What can we get away with and it still reads as an eye? And that's what anime does, or manga does, is you just keep pushing it and pushing it. It's like, okay, even this, it's still behaving pretty normally. And let's get a mouth. It's like, right, so there you go. Got like a cool anime style. But the thing is, you can exaggerate it even further. You can make eyes that don't exactly conform to any particular shape. You can really go wild because you know, like, okay, well, I did this much and I got away with it. So how do you go from realism to a style is really a case of understanding what your basic components are, and then what you can get away with, what you can push and pull, and look to others for inspiration to what they have done and, you know, gotten away with. So anyway, that's my long talk. Sorry, it was a very long video, but I hoped it helped, and thanks for watching.